So I will introduce Silvio Waisbord briefly. Silvio is professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. His scholarship, I think, can fairly be characterized as wide-ranging, as it covers news and politics, journalism, global health communication, communication and social change, and media policy. His most recent books include Media Movements, Civil Society and Media Policy Reform in Latin America, co-authored with Maria Soledad Segura, and News of Baltimore, Race, Rage in the City, which is a co-edited volume just out with Linda Steiner. Silvio is the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Communication and the past editor-in-chief of International Journal of Press Politics. And I think it's probably at least partly those editorial experiences that inform the subject that he's going to be talking with us today about, which is communication studies as a post-discipline. So please join me in welcoming Silvio.
Well, thank you very much for a kind introduction, Matt, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and spend time talking to all of you, part of the department that I admire for a long time. So I will talk from here rather than from there. Otherwise, I don't know if I have a clicker to move, but it's okay. I mean, I would love to be closer to you, all of you, but at least for here and then the Q&A, I approach the table. So, so what I'm going to present, as Matt correctly said, is sort of largely drawing from my editorial experience, particularly the last 2.5 years. I've been the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Communication, and it's a 4-year term, so I have a 1.5 years. And what I try to do is basically use the opportunity, tremendous opportunity that I was given by the International Communication Association to sort of reflect on the state of the field. So, and I'm working on a book which is basically on this subject. I thought originally the title for the book being The Art of the Deal, and then I realized that it was already used. So if you have a better title, please let me know. So the question here is sort of think about the state of the field of communication, and put field in quotations because this is exactly the concept that I want to interrogate. And it's largely given by this experience. And the first question that I have always, every time that I sort of get a submission to the journal, is what is communication? And in fact, I do lose sleep over sort of this question. And I don't think that actually too many people in the field actually have these, let's say, existential musings about what communication is or what defines communication research. Or at least I don't think that I had those kinds of questions until I took this position, because then I was confronted all the time with very simple, practical questions that have immediate repercussions for my job as well as for people who submit papers, right? Which is, what defines a paper as a communication study? This is the first question that I ask myself when I read a new submission. Is it the subject, the study of communication process or communication phenomena? Is it the theoretical framework that is firmly anchored in communication theories, so to speak, considering that our field or discipline, it stands at the sort of cross points of multiple fields and disciplines? Is it the question that is being asked, sort of a communication question, and if so, what makes it a communication question? Is it the relationship between variables? I mean, communication is an independent or dependent variable. The dependent variable could be a psychological process, and the dependent variable could be sort of media use, for example. So, again, these are questions that I ask myself to determine whether or not any given paper is a good fit for the journal, or it is not. So, and then when I look at a finished issue, I have this other set of existential questions. What brings together 6 or 8 articles under the rubric of Journal of Communication? Is this what the field is? Is this sort of what brings together articles about a wide variety of subjects? And you can look at the April issue, and you will see sort of an illustration of this. So people doing research on digital narcissism, or news framing of immigration, parental mediation of children's use of media, social network and health support, just to give you a flavor of the wide thematic variety of what is communication research that has a home in ICA, NCA, and many other professional associations, as well as communication journals. What brings it together? And that's sort of my starting point. Where we are. So I have I think it's sort of a unique vantage point to have sort of this broad perspective that I didn't have in my former life as someone doing research on news and politics or media activism. I didn't have sort of such a broad encounter with the sort of the breadth of the field. So first things I'm going to say are not new by any means. They have been said for quite some time. The state of fragmentation across lines of research, disciplinary traditions, theoretical methodological approaches. So there are different ways of cutting the multiple divides and the multiple ways in which communication studies is fragmented. We embodied what Snow classically called the two cultures of social science and the humanities. We straddle both in a very sort of important ways. Some of the old divides, for example, we have argued, the old divide between interpersonal mass communication. Some people are not so sure that it stands any longer, largely because of the digital revolution in ways that has sort of upended this traditional, not just analytical divides, but the ways in which communication processes work. And of course, this has been said time and time again. If you look at writings in the 50s, 60s, and even one of the last ferments in the field issue from the early 90s already identified this fragmentation and cohesion. Wilbur Schramm talked about this, and Rogers talked about it. Basically, everybody in the field has talked about this for a long time. And my sense is that communication was interdisciplinary before interdisciplinary became fashionable in academic quarters. So we have been wrestling with, in some ways, the question of fragmentation. In some ways, it is a question about the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary of the field. But what I disagree is that I don't think that they are, traditionally people have sort of viewed the field as having a central divide between two camps. The camp between mass and interpersonal, administrative and critical, so on and so forth. And I think there are actually multiple ways in which we can slice the pie of communication studies in terms of the level of analysis from individual to system, right? Individual, community, group, society, system, micro to macro, wide ranging of epistemological traditions in the field, from positives to radical epistemologies, a diversity of theoretical tradition, the endless thematic specialization. Just look at the divisions of, and thematic groups at ICA, and you will get a very good sense of what it is communication in settings, political settings, health, organizational, intergroup, instructional, et cetera, as well as the normative leanings in the way that people think about sort of the relationship between scientific work, academic work, and normative assumptions or arguments. What is interesting is that we are not alone. If you look at the literature on these issues in other disciplines, recent discussions in many disciplines actually portray the disciplines in ways that are not that different from this diagnosis about fragmentation in communication studies. So, and in fact, people have argued that we have a sort of a crisis of traditional disciplines such as psychology, sociology, political science, history, and the difficulties of unification, bringing back those disciplines around a common set of concerns or questions or theories. So to me, I'm bringing this up because this issue that we have been wrestling with in communication studies of fragmentation and dispersion actually are symptomatic of broad trends in the social sciences and in the humanities, issues that I will come back in a few minutes. So we are not alone, but there's something unique about that in my mind explains largely fragmentation, which is the ontological divide. And that is something that is not as acute as it is in traditional disciplines. So, for example, John Dewey famously said that communication is the most wonderful of all affairs, but actually there is no agreement on what communication is. or what communication means. So we were born as a field in a state of ontological disunity, and we are still in that sort of stuck in that situation in which not only we have disagreement about everything else that I just mentioned, but disagreement about the subject of study. And to me, this is where it sort of largely explains the productive chaos in our field. So just to give you a sample of definitions of communication, just again to illustrate this wide variety of understandings of how communication is understood. And this again, this is a very small sample. In the book, I have many more that actually talk about the diversity in which that the subject of the study is actually understood. And the way I see it is that basically there are 6 general understandings of communication. One is the idea that communication is basically connection or connectivity among individuals and societies. So, for example, all the studies on technology and communication historically, or the historical studies, basically approach communication as connectivity. Or then we have an alternative way of thinking about communication as dialogue, classically understood as the capacity to speak and to listen to others. And the dialogical tradition, of course, has strong influence in our field, but it's a different way of understanding communication compared to the idea of communication as connection or the ones that are mentioned here. Expression is about basically the way that we present ourselves to others, and this is something that in the literature, let's say, on activism or freedom of expression, is a particular way of understanding communication that is not about connectivity and is not necessarily about dialogue. And then you have the idea of communication as information, so studies about information processing, retrieval, storing, coming straight out of originally 1950s information studies, basically understands communication as a form of information. And the point is that is different from the previous ones that I mentioned. Same thing goes for communication as persuasion. And the huge literature on media effects actually essentially understands persuasion as deliberate efforts to change beliefs, attitudes, and behavior, which again is different from these previous understandings of what communication is. And then a 6th tradition is this idea of communication as symbolic interactivity. The idea that communication is about meaning making, that the notion that communication is essential to the process of becoming human, right? That, we cannot think about human activity or society outside of communication processes. And in somehow sort of these different definitions of communication generated a variety of research clusters that in my mind live in relatively splendid isolation from each other. So the persuasion and media effects literature is distinctively different from the literature on communication as cultural sense-making. Or the literature that understands or analyzes institutions of public communication, the structure and performance of journalism or PR or advertising, right? Or the literature that deals with sort of the way that people engage and practice and sort of social practices with media technologies, which is different, the questions that are asked from the previous ones, so on and so forth. So what I was trying to do is say, I'm not trying to present like a Borgesian map that captures the entirety of the communication field, but just to give you a sense of this huge diversity of research clusters that somehow are grounded on very different understandings of communication. And this is what, to me, illustrates this ontological disunity. And for a while, I think that we have been asking, or at least some people in the field have been asking these questions without obvious answers, which is cross-cutting dialogue possible? Cross-cutting dialogue among these different sort of research clusters. Who cares about this cross-cutting dialogue? It sounds great. But who is really legitimately interested in tending sort of laying bridges between these research clusters that have fundamental disagreements on what actually is communication? It's not just a question of emphasis or levels of analysis, but it's basically the definition of the object of study. And how can these bridges be built? So if we go back in history, when sort of this early diagnosis of this integration of this unity were originally formulated, Some people, like F. Rogers, for example, and Schramm as well, say, well, we are a young discipline. People said in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. We need time for cohesion, to develop sort of a unique communication theories or refine the subject of study. But my sense at this point is like, waiting for Godot, this idea that eventually will become a cohesive sort of discipline or a field. And it's hard to find examples of this kind of integration or grand theory or sort of master understanding of what communication as a unified field is. And the reason is, I think, because we are sort of running against these forces, intellectual and academic forces, that go against cohesion. And hyper-specialization, academic dispersion, go against this idea of intellectual cohesion, or formulating what Bob Craig in many writings have talked about, sort of something that will be the equivalent of a grand theory of communication. And there's very clear reasons why such an ambitious intellectual project is difficult for cohesion or for theoretical or ontological integration. Intellectual reasons first. First is that the complexity of the knowledge that we have produced make it very difficult for anyone to really master the tremendous amount of sort of wealth of data, findings, and arguments under the broad tent of communication studies to produce sort of this intellectual unity. And second, there are very good academic and institutional factors that undermine such effort. Why? Because of the drive towards specialization. The expectations that you have to be, in your academic career, be accepted and be recognized by a relatively small sort of academic tribe, or what has been known as an academic tribe, as opposed to by the communication sort of community at large, right? Again, we are not unique in this, but I mean, in the context of, it's very clear that academic careers are related to this process of hyper-specialization, rather than producing, sort of these bridges that will link the persuasion tradition with the dialogic tradition. But even if you look inside of each tradition, fragmentation is critical. And there are a number of recent articles exactly describing fragmentation within political communication studies, media policy, journalism, health communication. That is not just the field itself that is sort of dispersed, but even the areas of specialization are highly specialized themselves. So, to summarize this, the point is that there are not the right set of incentives to produce that kind of intellectual integration that some people have sort of hoped for quite some time. One can have actually a very industrious and illustrious career in communication without ever bothering about fragmentation and cohesion, right? Because the incentives are basically to become a specialist within certain lines of research, within areas of specialization, not just political communication, but within sort of certain important debates within what broadly is understood as that. So then this leads me to the question, can there be a field? Can we talk about a field without an ontological commons? So my diagnosis is the problem is not that it's a young field. It's that basically we are the confluence of many different epistemological traditions that explains why there is no really ontological commons. The commons is what I will explain later on, is an institutional commons rather than an ontological one. So what makes it a field then when there are no shared objects of study, common questions, theory, or methodology? Then in what sense we call it a field when we're talking about the field of communication? And it's not enough. It got even more complicated in the last decade. Why? Because of the digitalization of everything. What we can call legitimately the digital turn is not unique to communication studies, but basically it's everywhere. And I'm sure you guys already know this. In the social science of humanity, the digital turn has captured research interest across the fields. So something that we could legitimately claim as our own subject really is owned by everyone these days. So you can find research on learning and parenting and sort of digital impact around this, or collective action on policymaking, romance and religion, sex and violence, work and leisure, politics and health. And these issues are really way outside of what traditionally is communication studies, even though the digital technology, digital processes, digital phenomena are the center of this research. So this further complicates this issue. Can we claim ownership of communication when communication is everywhere? And just to be even more nasty, when actually much of this research not necessarily recognized communication work done around some of these questions. Plus, communication has not been a totalizing discipline. It has not been an imperialistic discipline, meaning the kind of discipline that has invaded, has been adopted by other disciplines. The way that we can think about economics or mathematics or psychology really had significant influence way beyond their original sort of disciplines. And to make matters even more complicated is the continuous further specialization. And this is what I'm saying from my sort of position as journal editor. Increasingly, the level of specialization across areas of specialization within an already highly fragmented field. Just to give you some examples of papers that I read recently for the journal. Questions are, how do people use mobile platforms for several purposes? And you name it. It could be for medical use, for political purposes, for sexual identity, you name it. Are parents effective agents of children experience in mediation? How do audiences navigate multi-level news layers? How do candidates use social media to encourage voting? These are really sort of, in some ways, empirical and theoretical questions that are driving much of the research that I see. But again, these questions largely exceed the conventional boundaries of communication studies. So I don't have a slide here. I decided to basically look at the institutional affiliation of people who submit work to Journal of Communication. And actually, I was quite surprised at the huge diversity of people where their home fields are, from psychology, computer science, history, management schools, business schools, that do quote-unquote communication work because they are engaged with some of these questions that we can legitimately recognize as communication questions. So this leads me to think that actually we're not a discipline, we're not a field. So what are we? We're basically post-discipline. We really represent what people recently have called sort of the rise or the emergence of post-disciplines. And let me explain what this is. Today there's sort of a strong appeal of interdisciplinary. I know that many naysayers or people who are really critical of interdisciplinarity, but it has been a strong movement that is explained from administrative as well as academic interest to the complexity of contemporary issues, that one disciplinary approach is insufficient to tackle sort of very interesting questions. Interdisciplines are sort of described as trading zones in terms of knowledge, theory, methodologies that are brought together by common concerns around typically real-world problems, sustainability studies, environmental studies, race studies, women's studies, so on and so forth, right? That it doesn't matter, where you come from in terms of discipline or theory, but you're brought together because you have sort of specific questions around typically real-world problems or challenges. And in some ways, my sense is that has been already happening in communication studies for quite some time. That this kind of sort of formation of research clusters around specific empirical or theoretical questions. But what happens is in this sort of interdisciplinarity is in specific research clusters rather than communication as a whole. In the research clusters that I mentioned sort of earlier, where people sort of freely drawing theories, arguments from a variety of disciplines, from psychology to computer science, political science, right, to basically analyze specific questions like the ones mentioned earlier. So what is a post-discipline? Post-discipline sort of moves away from traditional way of defining fields of study. Post-discipline lacks a single canon that refines research agendas, analytical frameworks, because it's driven by very specific sort of questions as opposed to necessarily theoretical questions, more like empirical questions. And I just gave you some examples of this. So in some ways, my sense is that communication better reflects this kind of interdisciplinarity among different clusters rather than a conventional sort of field or discipline. And the next question is, should we worry about this? And for a number of legitimate reasons, people have worried about this fragmentation and sort of lack of ontological unit. Why do people worry about this? Well, it has to do with the status of the field. It has with administrative questions and reputations. You know, deans and provosts asking questions, what do you guys do together? Do you guys belong together? And so why? Question of intellectual heft, that a respectable discipline or field needs to have its own sort of theoretical frameworks and arguments rather than living off, the bounty of psychological or political science theories, right? But the question is that to me, this project of intellectual integration, it's very difficult, almost impossible. To me, there's no easy path to overcome dispersion and reconcile long-standing divides. Basically because we, as a post-discipline, are organized around analytical empirical problems rather than big theoretical questions. And this in the context in which academic incentives today reward further specialization and fragmentation. So the tide is really against any kind of theoretical integration, even if that, as difficult as it is, could be possible. So if dispersion and divides are inevitable, this is what I argue, then what keeps communication studies together? And the answer is not an intellectual answer, but it's an institutional answer. Roger said back in that sort of Furman's issue, the names don't matter, all our programs focus on the study of information exchange between humans. It's all communication. And actually, it's not quite that simple because of what I said earlier, in multiple ways in which communication is actually defined. And John Peters, as always, many years ago, perceptively said that the field of communication will need to decide what it means by communication, and we are still stuck in that place. In the upcoming ICA, we're going to have a panel on fragmentation, yet again, which I was part of the co-organization of that panel. I think it's necessary to have it. The question is, how do we come up with more creative ways of resolving that puzzle, rather than yet again lamenting fragmentation? So what sustains a disjointed field? Very simple in my mind. It's a common allegiance to a multivocal concept, communication, as well as the institutional architecture. So what brings us together is not sort of a common intellectual enterprise or common subject, because we don't have it, but it's actually the institutional architecture, the professional organizations, the academic units, and the journals. And this is what, in some ways, what we have having organizations like ICA and NCA, which had a sort of an open-door intellectual policy for quite some time, which explains this receptiveness, this inclusiveness of different ways in which people understand what is communication. We mix it for a wonderful, rich, sort of interdisciplinary, post-disciplinary sort of way of thinking about these problems, but it exacerbates further this chaos, this idea of sort of a disjointed field. So the argument is that actually what defines communication are the institutions. Institutions make subjects. And anyone who, sort of sociology of knowledge has made this argument about a variety of subjects. That is the institutional architecture of the field of communication what brings us together rather than allegiance to a common intellectual enterprise or common subject of study. And one way to test this idea is, I have a chapter of the book looking at the globalization of communication studies. And actually, what I'm finding out is that different ways in which communication studies are defined in different countries and regions around the world, because institutionally this puzzle is resolved differently, not because there is a different intellectual answer to that question or theoretical answer. It's basically because of traditions, sort of epistemological and research tradition in different ways that how communication studies is defined. So what to do? And with this I will conclude. Well, what to do is basically need to embrace the post-disciplinary status and draw theoretical and analytical threads around contemporary social problems. I think one of the virtues that we have in communication studies is the need to recognize the pluralism and the diversity and engage with real-world problems that need to be approached by integrating multiple communication perspectives. And I have sort of some examples in which how that actually works. And the purpose of that is understand or sort of underscore the uniqueness of thinking about communication issues and questions for addressing social problems. So in my mind, the way that we resolve this is not just institutionally, which is the way that we have done it, but bringing together people who think in many different ways about communication around real-world sort of challenges that need to be approached for a multi sort of perspective about what communication actually is. So I will be happy to discuss some examples of that later. So that's where I am right now. That I mean, in some ways, it's an argument for why, in some ways it's useful. I mean, in some ways it's interesting to talk about sort of dispersion and fragmentation, yet the solution is not in the traditional solution of aspiring for ontological unity or for grand theories of communication. I will stop there. Thank you.
I see this as kind of an argument to other people in the field, however defined. And I can imagine that arguments might have to be different to external audiences, whether or not those are the deans you're mentioning who want to know what it is that we're up to,
right,
or whether or not it's parents of students who want to know why should my daughter or son study in this field.
Or my money will soon go.
Exactly. And so I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on that? Are they completely separate stories?
Yeah, separate story. I mean, as part of that, I've been sort of interviewing colleagues in different communication departments to see how they resolve these challenges at a very administrative level. And there is no master solution, so it depends on what the unique combination of administrative challenges are: composition of the faculty, the programs, the majors, the history program, where the university is located. That I have yet to find someone who has sort of given let's say, an intellectual answer to that question in terms of what brings us together is, let's say, a common subject, because there is the wider condition that when you have in the school, say, advertising, PR, journalism, interpersonal communication, I mean, with different combinations that are like multiple combinations around, different campuses. Just in this country, when you go somewhere else, it gets even more complex. Then it is very sort of particular, very unique to that sort of context, based on what we have, what do we do, what majors we offer, how do we tell our story about what brings us together. But what it brings us together is a unique challenge to us. I mean, that we primarily are being asked those sort of questions. What do you guys have in common, right? And those are the answers that I've heard that people typically give to, parents or students or administrators. Right? So I can give you examples of how it is addressed, but it's very, very specific. I find a common challenge rather than a common answer. What reinforces my sense that this is sort of is institutionally resolved rather than intellectually resolved.
So in a disjointed field in which there are a sort of proliferation of journals serving the different segments of the field, how do you think about the role of a journal of communication?
Right. Well, this is when I sent my letter of application that day. What I proposed basically that, Journal of Communication should not, there's an abundance of specialized niche journals. So Journal of Communication cannot duplicate that. Journal of Communication should be probably one of the few places that is as comprehensive as, quote unquote, the field is. That it should reflect the diversity of ICA. And ICA, in my mind, we could discuss that, is pretty inclusive in terms of the wide variety of ways that people understand communication and communication research. And Journal of Communication, as the flagship journal, the oldest journal of the association, should reflect that sort of wide agenda. And that's what I try to do. And that's one of the criteria I use when I decide whether or not a submission fits in the journal. Some submissions can be very solid in many ways, but are too niche for JOC. So I say, well, maybe you're better off, because I specifically asked the reviewers, is this piece of broad interest to the community of communication scholarship as opposed to just people who do health communication, right? So that is the place that nobody else has, and that no other journal has. And I think it belongs to sort of JOC's mission. Otherwise, you cannot do it, because there are like 30, 40, 50 niche journals. So which one are you going to what gaps are you going to fill out? No, the only gap, the main gap, this is it should be a journalist journal. And, but then the challenge is, at a time of hyper-specialization, when people speak increasingly, in my mind, to even a narrower audience, then there are not that many pieces that actually have a broad audience in mind. And I can give you some examples of this. So let's say in health comm. Let's say message design within health comm. Let's say message design within health comm that specializes on specific diseases, message design, cancer, HIV, or, So it's, therefore, there are some pieces that will be very interesting for a really specialized audience, but not necessarily they will be broad enough theoretically, analytically, conceptually, for even sort of the community of health communication scholars, let alone people who do health communication, media effects, visual communication, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a long way of saying that is my idea. Still is my vision for the journal. Yet it's hard to reconcile it with a highly fragmented, highly sort of hyper-specialized sort of way in which we organize our work, including myself. So,
I reviewed an article for you a couple months ago, and so this was the question. There were other reasons to say no on this article, but I couldn't really figure out how, what was meant by too niche.
By too niche is that is basically, let's say there are a number of people working, let's say, on game studies. And you can work on game studies from a variety of traditions. Necessarily communication questions are at the center. So maybe a game studies journal will be better suited for that. But if you really sort of do research that is grounded in game studies, but ask a very important communication question, then it's better suited for JOC. That will be an example. Right? That's what typically sort of happens. So I can give you other examples, but that has been one of the challenges that I have sort of vision, yet frequently because of specialization, we're trying to write for a niche audience. Right? Yeah.
If we're connected by our institution, how do we explain the value of communication to people who don't have stakes in this academic institution? What is from your perspective, what's the unique value of communication? If I want to study public health, why not get a degree in public health? Or if I want to study algorithms, why not get a degree in information
right.
science? What is it, do you think, that is the sparkling insight that communication gives us?
To me, it's difficult to answer the question in abstract. I will have a hard time answering the question in abstract because ultimately it depends on what is the specific issue that bothers you, that you're interested in, why a communication perspective, either from a dialogical understanding, informational, cultural persuasion, will help you understand better that phenomenon. But whatever question you can think about. That is when you can make a more reasonable argument, evidence-based argument about why communication really adds to understanding better a certain phenomenon, or why it brings something that really is missing if you take a traditional, let's say, computer science or psychology perspective on that. That's, to me, that is part of the challenge. That's why, in this last chapter is about sort of thinking about real-world problems and what is it different ways of understanding communication bring to the table that will be missing if you don't have a communication broadly understood perspective. Sorry to be so, abstract, but I mean, it's really because I have a hard time saying categorically, this is what it is. Because as soon as I embrace one understanding of communication, someone say, what about this other understanding of communication? And that person will be absolutely right, right? So if you say, well, people, if you don't understand communication the way that people make meaning around, health or construction notions about health of illnesses or illness, which is a long tradition of health communication working from that sort of constructivist perspective. Someone will say, what about persuasion in health communication? Yeah, that's also something that we traditionally have brought typically from communication studies that most people in public health are not probably completely fully aware of. Yet, many people who work in health communication are housed in public health schools. So there you go.
I'm completely with you on this whole idea that integration, we don't have a theoretical integration, we don't have an epistemological integration, we have some sort of institutional integration,
right.
But I'm not even sure that we have that, right? Because we have different institutions. So you've been talking about the Journal of Communication, which is an ICA journal. I would never submit to that journal, not because it's too broad, but in a sense because it's not broad enough.
Right.
I'm an NCA scholar, right?
Right.
I don't look at all of the examples of the things that you said, were examples of things that were submitted to that journal. I study speeches.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It was an illustrative list because to me, in my sort of Catholic understanding, yes, that is part of communication as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
But ICA, as I understand it, was formed sort of broke off of, well, some people broke off of NCA and said, NCA is too rhetoric oriented. We want to have
right.
something that's more social scientific. And so I guess my question to you is, if we have these institutions that bring us together, but our institutions aren't even integrated, our institutions are separated. And a lot of universities have two communication departments, right? One that's devoted to speech communication or communication studies, and the other that's devoted to mass communication
right.
or communications and journalism. As long as our institutions are still separated, I'm wondering if it seems to me that's what's going to keep us from integrating.
You're absolutely right. I mean, in George Washington, we have a communication study, which is basically speech communication, rhetoric, and our school, which is media and politics, right? So there's different combinations, and there is a constant sort of institutional challenges to redefine, this idea of how do we define what we do. I think in the journal, at least my journal, I have complete freedom to decide what I mean by communication. But once I say, oh, I'm free to decide that, then I have a headache. It's like, and this is the presentation and the book. How do I solve this question of, yes, you're being all-inclusive, but at the same time, it raises questions, so how do you understand it? In ways, because some people still have very clear understandings of what is and what is not communication studies. And I respect that. The question is that even if you have an argument, it's very difficult to really bring together, quote unquote, the field around one notion of what is and what is not communication. That is sort of, ain't gonna work, right? But also we are past the time in the social science of the humanities of grand, integrating, totalizing theories. I mean, if you read sort of the debates for the last decades around that, it's not just the suspicion of such an attempt, but the fact that it's not feasible to actually produce that for a variety of intellectual and administrative reasons, right? So that's where we are, quote unquote, stuck. The best option is this institutional sort of, understanding of what communication studies is. But it raises other problems like the one you just mentioned. But I'm personally, if you want to send an article on rhetoric or speech to Journal of Communication, we do receive articles like that. And the question is, to me, is not, it's perfectly fine with me as long as you make an argument to the reviewer saying why that article, deserves an audience beyond the specialist in political rhetoric, right? So that's the way I sort of try to address that question. If you persuade the reviewers that your question, your argument, et cetera, is broad enough for a certain sort of part of the field, it's fine with me, assuming that everything else is strong, et cetera. But in terms of the thematic focus, the theoretical framework. So That will be my answer to that question.
But why would I send it there instead of Communication Monographs, which is the generalist journal for NCA? Because I guess what I'm saying is just that as long as we still have these institutionally separated...
What are the incentives to actually send to a journalist?
It's very hard to bring...
Right. Some people
communication as a
send it because the departments for tenure cases expect people to publish in Journal of Communication. Simple as that. And some people because they want to reach a broader audience rather than the audience you will reach with just the Journal of Health Communication, for example. Right? And saying that's fine. As long as you tackle a question that is important in your field, but it's also relevant to people studying, I don't know, let's say media effects, or communication and social capital, or I don't know, I mean, all kinds of other questions that goes beyond, I'm saying narrow, not in a derogatory way, but in a way that it addresses a particular sort of academic niche. So otherwise, JOC should not duplicate the work that specialized journals are doing, let's say in HealthCom, for example. So the reason why, and many probably why people send to JOC or not.
You said you had some examples about what those real-world problems or framing it in that way would look like. And how do you strike a balance between focusing on those problems without being too applied or not theoretical enough, and not having some of your pieces maybe be ending up in the Journal of Applied Comm Research?
Right.
Feeling like it could only live there.
Well, I mean, the question is that I don't believe necessarily that it's a strong divide between applied and theoretical work. I mean, you can come up with very sophisticated theoretical work that is based on real-world cases, whether or not you think that has immediate applications, your, let's say, theoretical argument, or you are sort of focused on these are the practical applications of my argument. I'm not so fond of that sort of strong divide between one or the other. To me, the question is more the divide or sort of the gap that exists between, let's say, more conventional academic work and sort of applied work, or particularly in the fields that I know better, let's say journalism studies or communication and social change, which in principle there will be a lot of applied work that is not, and very little sort of communication, for lack of a better word, between the field of practice and the field of theoretical sort of research. The special issue for this year will be on communication and social change and collective action. And one of the guest editors had the hope that it will be really straddling practice and theory, let's say. And most of the work is very theoretical. I mean, interesting actually, but it has no practical application, even though they're talking about real-world cases. So it's a matter of perspectives, a matter of incentives, a matter of sort of all kinds of reasons why it will explain, in my mind, that gap. I'm always fascinated by this disconnect when you have academics and journalists, people who do journalism studies and journalists in the same room talking about almost past each other. So the question is, who do we write for? Do we write for practitioners? Do we write for each other? Again, not original questions here, but I mean, that will explain partially that sort of, that problem. So back to your question, I think we can examine real-world problems from a variety of communication perspectives without necessarily saying it is only quote-unquote theoretical work or practical work. Depends what you want to do, who do you want to write for. You can do different kinds of writing for different audiences. So that's the way one could solve that issue. Yeah.
So it seems like I'm with you on the need to embrace kind of post-disciplinary, and it seems that in some ways communication is kind of, in some ways, ahead of the curve and where a lot of disciplines are going, right, where it's driven not by objective study or epistemology or methodology, but by a driving question.
Right.
And then
Right.
you have, increasingly in universities, clusters of people. You might have anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists and communication scholars. hovering around, working together, around a driving question.
Right.
I'm curious what ways you think, not institutions like NCA, ICA, but institutions like universities might be changing or should change to better accommodate scholarship that doesn't fit neatly in a department.
Right. Well,
But
we're in the middle of that debate, right? And there are people on one side praising the virtues of post-disciplinary, interdisciplinarity. We were talking about that earlier. Many provosts and funders who get very excited about interdisciplinary programs. I mean, today, if you really want to get funders excited, you don't establish the Department of Political Science, or the Department of Sociology, sustainability studies, urban problem studies. I mean, all kinds of stuff that really will get very sort of much more focused attention about real world sort of problems. The problem is that we're still organized in universities around largely disciplines, and there is the force of inertia. And I'm doing this in a positive way, actually, because I do have respect for for the disciplines in the traditional sense. It's still very, very strong, right? And then when it comes to time to funding, staffing, interdisciplinary programs, then we have the old sort of conflict whether or not people are affiliated with the discipline, the traditional department, or are in specific sort of interdisciplinary programs or post-disciplinary programs. I was telling Matt earlier on that when I was in grad school, my dream was to have a job in a Latin American studies program. That's why I came to this country in some ways. And then I realized that Latin American studies program don't hire people. People are hired by political science, international relations, sociology, and then eventually have a joint appointment. Really? Oh, okay, so I have to rethink my overall strategy here. So this is an all factor in which sort of you have pull and push between the disciplines and the post-discipline sort of moment. So you can praise the virtues of post-disciplinarity, and we're talking about Craig Calhoun as being, has been a strong voice around this, but you have to understand that the way that universities function in some ways, there is some, not just intellectual skepticism about the solidity or the intellectual heft of quote-unquote post-disciplines, but about very concrete repercussion in terms of resource allocation, students, funding, all this kind of stuff that academics, that have nothing to do with intellectual issues, have all to do with administrative sort of questions, right? So it seems to me, where we are right now. We are sort of in the middle of that sort of tension. So every time I read these sort of very eloquent arguments in favor of interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary, I say, how does it work in the real university world? Right? Intellectually, I'm with it. I'm a sociologist by training. I move almost sort of without problem to communication studies. So I believe in that stuff. But the question is, how do we ask sort of, because it is, again, is a very controversial question, the way that you organize academic units. It's not just the way you organize intellectual work. Yeah.
I've got a question that relates to that. So one of the institutional factors, I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to, is the teaching mission of these different departments. All right. So journalism departments at some level need to crank out journalists.
Right.
Speech and debate departments crank out speakers and debaters.
Right.
And in this post-disciplinarity sense, is that historic teaching mission a helpful mooring or an unfortunate shackle?
Right. Great question. I mean, all these questions are great questions, but this one, I don't think I have a good answer to that. I'm sorry. Because I'm trying to solve a different problem. Let's see, my sad excuse is that question is that ultimately, when you talk about administrative, when sort of the rubber hits the ground, it's just really about administrative questions, about training students who major or graduate in certain degrees, and we agree that they need certain curriculum, certain skills, and how funding and lines for faculty hire. Everybody has experienced this, I assume. Where they are sort of positioned or housed, right? So I don't think I can solve that sort of. It's more of an academic question as opposed to an intellectual question. I mean, because
It's an institution that impinges upon.
Right.
It's a major institutional factor.
Right. I'm not advocating for let's forget about the disciplines and break up everything, and everything will become sort of interdisciplinary programs, you name it, of whatever. And we have 50 programs in which you have people originally trained in computer science, psychology, and everything in between spread across this. That's not what I'm advocating for. Because my question is, so how do we make sense of communication? And how do we embrace our wonderful chaos, as opposed to lamenting it or hoping that eventually someone will come up with this grand theory that will say, you know what, this is what communication is. And what you think communication is, it's not. It's actually something else. Well, we can spend a lot of time, it's like a rocking chair. We can get entertained, but we're not going to go anywhere. I mean, just if we just focus on those questions. So that's what I'm not advocating to say, or the implication of what I'm arguing is not completely change the administrative structure in the way that not only knowledge, but sort of academic units are organized. But I mean, I should sort of, in case I get asked that question again, I should have a better answer probably. So,
besides that, you have a slide there where you make a statement saying communication is not actually interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. Then you move on, you're advocating for
right.
approach to communication perspective. So I may have missed it, but I didn't hear you unpack your statement. Why should it be considered multidisciplinary instead of interdisciplinary?
Right, multidisciplinary.
What are you trying to do here with your available advocating for the integration of multiple perspectives?
Right, because multiple perspectives is the way that communication is understood, is defined, back to one of the earlier slides. The question is that multidisciplinary is different from interdisciplinary, right? Multidisciplinary is the field, it brings people who have been trained and who approach communication from very different sort of disciplinary backgrounds. It doesn't mean that there is dialogue or cross-cutting interest with people who come from these different disciplinary backgrounds to basically look at one phenomenon from that perspective. That is different. And I think that's why I'm saying has been more sort of multidiscipline receptiveness to people trained in a variety of disciplines, including communication, rather than sort of fostering necessarily this kind of multidiscipline sort of collaboration. There are exceptions, but I mean, the point was not to confuse those two concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, you had a slide early on that had, I think, your 6 understandings of communication.
Yeah.
Well, we are in the unenviable position of trying to come up with a 5-credit introductory course to our communication.
Right, I heard that.
Would those 6 areas be a way for us to organize that introductory course, do you think?
When I presented this, I think so. And when I presented this to the publisher, to Paul, he said, why don't you organize the book around this? And I said, hell no, I'm not going to write that. I cannot write it. I mean, who am I to write a knowledgeable chapter on the huge diversity of persuasion studies? I'm not an expert at that. I cannot do it. I will sort of be, sort of borrowing whatever else already has been said. But in my mind, when I'm looking at this sort of tremendous wealth of research, in my mind, and I'm missing some things that I would love to, be corrected, as opposed to when the book is out, say, well, you forgot about this, I'm sorry. That really, these are sort of the different ways in which people conceptualize what communication is. Sometimes it's explicit, often it's implicit in the way they understand what you understand by communication. So yes, I mean, this, to me, if you are to organize an introduction class, you can think about sort of, these are different ways. And there are some books actually have tried to do some of this. Those sort of, probably more implicitly rather than explicitly the way I'm trying to do here. That these are sort of different ways, pretty much all grounded in classic studies of rhetoric and speech and, that the way that communication is understood. And yet, one could argue the same quote-unquote communication act could be understood simultaneously in these 6 ways. And that is absolutely right. But it's not a matter of emphasis, it's a matter of conceptualizing that, let's say, the communication act that we're having right now, is it an act of persuasion? Is it a dialogue? Is it a sense-making? Yeah, you can say all of those. The question is, what are you particularly interested in in this particular communication act. So it could be helpful to basically, as a way to map out, to provide a roadmap to particularly undergrad, but also the grad students, a way that different ways that sort of communication research or traditions exist.
I'm trying to think through the arguments that I've heard for what is the defining feature of communication. One often argument is that message, the unit of analysis, is the common thread that weaves communication together.
Right.
What's your response to that argument?
There are a lot of communication scholars who don't study messages, don't even call it a message, that they are more interested in process as opposed to specific discrete entities called messages. So let's say the literature on connection in some ways has a very tenuous relationship to the idea.
Message as an impetus for connection, or the antecedent to connection. Or the
It depends how do you understand what connection or connectivity is, right? So on dialogue, the dialogic tradition in communication studies is not necessarily primarily interested in in message studies. It's more of an interactivity in values, in dispositions to dialogue, rather than per se in studying messages. I mean, the message tradition, clearly, you find it in the persuasion and the information tradition, more at least a concern with sort of message design, message transmission, message understanding,
where it's primary,
message storing, et cetera, right? It's not the only thing here. I mean, persuasion, I know, is much broader than just message study. But in other traditions, really, here there's no, in my mind, or in expression, fundamental concerns with message in the way that is understood or defined in the persuasion tradition. So that's what I'm remain skeptical, that we can have, yes, we're all studying the same thing, so to speak.
Problems and questions and try to find a solution or empirical approach or whatever approach to give answers to these problems. And in your last bullet point, you say we should stress the uniqueness of thinking about communication issues. And I struggle between these 2 points because I think a lot of theoretical ideas, but also methodological approaches, do not necessarily stem from the communication discipline. We take it from all the other disciplines, sociology, psychology, whatever. And sometimes it's hard for me to actually figure out, is it a communication theory that I'm working with, or does it come from somewhere else? So why then should we stick with the uniqueness of trying to underline that something is very unique to our field? Is probably, let's say at least, I can more say for the social sciences, the cross-disciplinary taking up of ideas might help us more to answer these societal problems.
Absolutely right. But let's say the case that Lance mentioned earlier. If you guys are studying the consolidation of a right-wing media ecology, or whatever you guys want to call it, then what is it that a communication perspective will add to a phenomenon that I am sure is being studied by, a lot of people in the social sciences and the humanities, right? So what will it add to understand better the rise, the consolidation, the impact of a right-wing public space or discourse? And that is dealing with a real problem by highlighting the communications. You highlighted the communication dimensions of studies, not necessarily because some of the methodologies or theories are unique to communication. In fact, they may not be, right? And that's what it brings to a variety of communication studies people, with people who study, let's say, message design, understanding, and effects, from people who study more the political economy of the right-wing media ecology, right? That's what I have in mind. Is that clear? So people who understand message effects can process something interesting about that subject, the way people who study, let's say, media activism or the use of digital platforms to mobilize voters, or people who study political economy of new media, or people who study why, let's say, fake news, or, not that I'm accusing that in space of fake news, but I mean, of why certain fake news have stickiness, sticky power, right? So these are all communication questions. These are not limited to one kind of brand or cluster. So bringing together around a very concrete sort of question that is not a theoretical question. You can use theoretical ideas, concepts, and arguments to answer it. But it's driven by, that's what I mean by a real world sort of event development process that requires, ideally, multiple communication perspectives to say this is how communication helps to understand better the causes, implications, so on and so forth. That's sort of what I have in mind. I mean, how it could work.
I'm wondering if you have noticed any distinctions in, like, generational distinctions in terms of how junior scholars think about interdisciplinarity, post-disciplinarity compared to senior scholars. Like, I'm thinking of my own experience kind of coming of age as a scholar when I just search for material. Like, I don't feel any allegiance to any journals. I don't think I've ever read a journal cover to cover. I do a search based on a topic I'm interested in. I'm happy to take good ideas from anywhere I can find them and integrate them from within a communication perspective. And I think that's a very different experience than somebody from a different generation where you would wait for your journal of communication to arrive on your desk and read it from cover to cover, and sort of how that influences people's perspectives on the field.
Yeah, I mean, at best probably have anecdotal, impressionistic sort of evidence around this. I mean, everything you said is absolutely right, that people don't read a journal from, beginning to end. And, we're talking about earlier, when you do a Google search, it's not, you care about the subject, the arguments, rather than necessarily or primarily where it was published, whether or not it was communication or not a communication journal. Maybe it's a generational thing, but I don't think that we ever were so, again, for better or for worse, in my mind for better, so strict about intellectual boundaries. So I think that probably the developments that you mentioned further sort of exacerbated this idea that you borrow ideas from different disciplines or fields that are somewhat interested in the question that you care about without checking whether or not is, what discipline you come from or something like that. So it might be a generational thing. I'm not sure. I don't think that I will have the evidence to say, yes, it's primarily it's driven by a different way of looking at this. My thinking about JOC is that if people in the field find that at least there is one or two articles a year in JOC that speak to what they are interested, that's okay. Because again, when this diversity that I mentioned, I just gave you a sample of this huge diversity, how do you serve these multiple constituencies in communication studies? It's very difficult. Plus you have, and I was mentioning this earlier, in ICA, particularly in ICA, the size of the membership of different divisions is hugely varies. So we tend to get a lot of articles from certain divisions as opposed to other divisions, not just because of JOC or people's perception of what JOC publishes, but just because of the size of the membership in different divisions. Communication technology, journalism studies, political communication, health comm, we get a lot of submissions. Submissions about ethnicity, race, visual communication, not so much. And I don't think it's because I am biased against one or the other, it's just because the number of people within the association that feel that JOC is a place for them to publish. So that has been one of my challenges. I mean, how you diversify sort of the thematic representation of the journal considering the wide diversity in the association. And I don't think I have a good solution. I will not publish something because we never publish anything on, science communication, and now is the turn to publish a paper on science communication. Of course, I will not do that. But that is definitely a sort of a challenge that I have.
I really like the idea of this point there.
Mhm.
I wonder if you have any examples of it actually working, because my fear is that the differences, recognizing pluralism and diversity is one thing, actually working together is another, and I think my fear is that epistemological, methodological differences in purposes,
Right.
applied or theoretical, all these things are going to make it too hard for the people working together from these different communication perspectives, even if they have a shared common problem that they're dealing with, it's going to make it hard for them to actually speak to each other.
So, well, think about a sort of a real-world problem development that you think that potentially can bring people who otherwise might not have much in common. Yet, they are communication scholars for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So, why, the whole literature on fact-checking, or, why is it so difficult to, quote-unquote, correct misinformation? I don't think that really one from a single communication approach can produce a convincing, comprehensive answer to that question, because you can draw from a variety of literatures to really understand why that is, from, at least the application of cognitive psychology to media effects, to questions related to group identity, to, somewhere there is when you can provide a more sort of richer, fuller explanation for why, misperceptions in certain groups of the population are so difficult, or misinformation are so difficult to correct. What are we talking about? Science issues, political issues, you name it, right? That's, for example, what I tried to do with the first special issue for the journal, which was on sort of misinformation, which to me says, like, suddenly I realized that people in science comm, health comm, political comm, were dealing basically with the same theoretical problem, which is something of, what I just mentioned. It was like, why don't we have a special issue, which is basically trying to say why the problems are different, regardless of whether, you primarily have a quantitative or a qualitative approach. You use group identity as your master theory, or you use, selective perception. And that, to me, sort of in some ways gave me the sense that probably that is a way of saying why sort of the diversity in communication studies can come together around sort of very specific sort of empirical problems that need to be addressed from a variety of perspectives. To me, that will be an example. Like I mentioned a few more, but they're closer to my own sort of interest in journalism studies or political communication.
Yeah, that's a good example. It'd be really interesting to see if there were people who read everything in that special issue, right? To see if the people...
Right. From what I get, again, this is anecdotally...
That would be the evidence that kind of thing...
Right. Anecdotally, yes, because you have similar developments. So if you think about, the anti-vaccine movement, the belief in death panels, another issue, there are some common threads there that raises sort of interesting theoretical questions based on sort of a somewhat comparable empirical development. People believing in something regardless of facts, and facts being unable to correct this, even if they are presented by credible sources within those groups, so on and so forth. So, and the reason why that idea was brought to me, and before I came to GW, I worked for an NGO doing international development communication kind of work. And I did some work on anti-vaccination movements in India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, which was exactly that problem. The problem of why people believe something in light of facts. It's very naive and very simple understanding that facts will change mind. I'm sorry to say that. No matter who the source is, or the credibility of the source, or the characteristics of the message. So to me, it was like, well, these are connecting threads. Right? Health comm, science comm, polycomm. Why don't we have a dialogue right across this? This is what some examples that I have in mind.
Maybe just to follow up on this question, I'm wondering, I can imagine that if this was recognized, that a big question then becomes, well, who gets to decide?
Right.
And so in your practical case, it's like, okay, the journal editor gets to decide. But I can also imagine that there then emerges problems in terms of the questions don't just drop, they don't just drop down from the sky.
Right.
And so it sounds like part of your answer is that the scale at which it happens is not field, and so it's not as if the Department of Communication at the University of Washington is all going to start studying fake news, right?
No, but I mean, sometimes inside departments that you have common questions that bring people together with different expertise around a common problem that, happen. I'm trying to think very fast about specific cases in which.
Like in the UK, I know that happens,
right? Right. I mean.
But I guess the question that I'm curious about is like, I can quickly begin to imagine how if this was embraced, then the next question becomes who gets to decide what these problems are, right? In other words, it won't be.
I don't think there is by no one and by everyone, right?
But so I guess maybe to sort of put it in bald terms, it's kind of like who benefits most from this and who doesn't benefit?
I think it's a question of tapping into this diversity of approaches rather than perpetuating a way that certain problems can only be answered or addressed by one quote-unquote disciplinary or theoretical perspective or methodological approach. That will be a way to address this. And of course, then we're dealing with these questions later on. Well, you're in a communication department, but you have to publish in a communication journal. Wonderful that you do environmental communication, you publish in all these environmental studies journals. Wonderful. But you're in a communication department, right? So this idea doesn't necessarily marry with the cold reality of how, departments and tenure and, all these administrative, academic questions deal with. So I'm not proposing to solve that problem. That's my sort of sad excuse. So. But, I mean, by everyone and by no one. Yes?
Several times you use the phrase community of communication scholars. And I'm wondering if that's maybe a more apt way, rather than thinking about it as a discipline or a field. If you think about the community analogy, it's communities coalesce around problems that
Right.
face them, and their strongest communities have diversity,
Right.
which they bring to solving those problems.
It's a great point. Or they coalesce around institutions, or institutions where there's a professional association, or a journal. When we think about communities of interest, that in some ways, what we might say, might sound probably a little bit too wishy-washy, not quote-unquote rigorous enough. But in some ways, we're closer to that rather than something that it is in the traditional way we understand and define fields, right? Which has a very clear subject of study. And that is exactly the point of departure for these reflections, that I don't find it, that's why I asked this question. So yes, in fact, in one of my letters that I use in response, I use the word community of communication scholars, something like that, because I couldn't find, something that is not a mouthful or something like a weird, sort of to the post-discipline of communication studies, right? So probably I'm more sort of favor that kind of language to call this, yes.
Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.